So I just wanted to welcome you to this interview and thank you so much for your time. I think just to start, if you could introduce yourself, your position, your current position, your educational journey, or maybe your career journey, and just talk about like who you are. That would be really great.
Yeah, of course. So let me make sure I have all that. So my name's Honorine.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a third year PhD candidate at the University of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
I'm officially in a program for development, regeneration, and stem cell biology, but I'm more specifically working in a lab that studies it's a neurobiology lab, and we study the maintenance of neuronal identity throughout life, so after neuronal birth. Um, and then, sorry, you mentioned something after that as
Yeah,
well.
just your education journey so far. So like you're a PhD now, but like where you did your undergrad, and things like that.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, so I did my undergrad at the University of Texas at Austin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was a biology major with a focus in genetics and genomics, and then I simultaneously did a minor in primatology. And so I did some lab work. I did a little bit of different lab research experiences in my undergrad,
Mm-hmm.
but I was primarily in a lab that studied kind of the intersection of population genetics and primate behavior to see how different social dynamics were in Shifaka lemurs.
Okay. So I think my first question to you is just sort of about how you became interested in all of this, because I guess now your work is more related to stem cells and regenerative like biology, but then you were interested in genetics before. So just how did you develop an interest for all of this? How did it sort of progress? And then just sort of, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I kind of don't know how to pinpoint where I started because honestly, I've kind of always loved like nature as a theme. Like even when I was a kid,
Mhm.
um, I was actually home for the holidays recently, and I was opening up this old like diary journal I had, and I had completely forgotten that this happened. But in third grade, my teacher gave us this assignment to like take home this little beetle or whatever. Like it was a larva at the time, and you were supposed to take care of it until it hatched into or like a metamorphosed into a beetle. Um, and in my notes at the time, I had written like, oh, I took my beetle out of its cage and I gave it a red paper and a blue paper, and it climbed onto the red paper, so I gave it the red paper in its cage. Um, and so it was like this very it struck me, and I remember reading it again because it was a very like early notice of like I'm almost setting up an experiment, with what the
Yeah.
wanted.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And it's something my parents have always fostered in me. So when I was around that same age, I asked for a microscope for one of my birthdays, and my parents got me this little light microscope. And I accidentally cut my finger, and I got really excited because I could, now look at my blood under the microscope without having to cut myself. um, and then in high school, I've always known that I kind of love biology just because I think the principle of life is really beautiful in all of its forms. And so getting into like a more refined research topic is actually something that I found happened a little more randomly. So like um in undergrad, it was a question of I happened to meet these professors that did this kind of work, and so I got roped into it. And then in the PhD program, the way a lot of the programs are set up in STEM here is that you do like a cycle of rotations and you try out different labs. And it happened to be that this lab was particularly interesting to me, and I got along with the professor. So honestly, a little bit of luck from ambition that stemmed from this value for life and development in nature that my parents had encouraged in me since I was young.
Okay. Yeah, so like because you talked a little bit about your high school, like you started with that, I sort of wanted to ask you a little bit more about that because most of our audience members are high schoolers. So just like if you could speak a little bit about the things you did in high school, maybe some extracurriculars that you were a part of, you think still like help you today or contribute to the work that you do right now, or just like, just about yourself in high school, that would be kind of cool to listen to.
Yeah, of course. In high school, So I did some extracurriculars, but actually not that many science related. I was really into band. I played and I still play a little, but not as much. I played clarinet.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so a lot of like music groups I was a part of. As science wise, I didn't do so many extracurriculars, but I was definitely like I took every single science class that I could.
Mhm.
Um, just to like anatomy physiology, AP Chem, AP Bio, AP Physics 1, AP Physics 2, just everything I could get my hands on. I was really excited to be able to do.
Mhm.
Um, and so I actually spent a good chunk of my high school just studying. Not certain yet as to what I wanted to do. I had a particular interest for biochemistry in my senior year because I was intrigued by the interface between how do you go from these inanimate macromolecules to actually building life and what's that line and that distinction.
Mhm.
Um, and then I got to college and realized I didn't particularly care for biochemistry that much. Um, but I was definitely actively thinking about what I wanted to do in the future, even though I didn't quite have concrete plans for it yet. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then another question that I usually ask people, I'm sorry, I'm okay. So I was just gonna say I'm like running on 3 hours of sleep, so like I feel like sometimes I'm just like I don't know what I'm saying anymore. So it's been a rough week, but I wanted to ask you about like some of the work that you do for your PhD and just like the things that you're working on right now. Just to like hear more about that.
Yeah, of course. And as a side note, I really hope you get some sleep after this.
I'm getting better at this. Not like super great, but like I'm like out of words right now, and I could tell that I'm like sleepless.
Like,
Um,
um,
so if you could tell me about your like PhD and things you do, that'd be cool.
yeah, of course. So I prefaced a little bit. I was talking about how we studied neurobiology, and it's kind of
Mhm.
a broad term.
Yeah.
But and this kind of relates back to another question that you had asked as well, which is how do you pick a particular field? And I find that I've had a fairly significant overlap in the things that I've learned. So, for example, in undergrad, I studied genetics, and now I don't study genetics per se, but I use genetics to study what I work in. So, yeah, you don't always fully. I mean, now I do nothing related to, the population genetics of lemurs that I did before, but a lot of the themes still exist. And so to finally get at the question you asked,
Mhm.
um, I study, um, how do I phrase this? I study how neurons remain neurons their entire life.
Okay.
Yeah, and I do this using a type of microscopic worm. It's like 1 millimeter at its adult stage, called C. elegans. I don't know if you ever heard of it.
I am not, but
Yeah, it's a
I'll look
little.
it up. I mean, after the interview, I guess I could do that.
They're really fun to watch. A lot of my work, I just, you're working with these worms and you're moving them around under the scope, and
Hmm.
they have this really beautiful curving motion. It's very sinusoidal and very elegant. And it's produced. This movement is produced as a result of their the nervous system, of course, that they have.
Hmm.
And C. elegans was initially established as a model to try to understand what are the building blocks of behavior. And so their nervous system has been extremely well characterized.
Hmm.
Um, and so now we use it as a platform to understand how these neurons, which go through a lot of complex genetic and molecular and cell biological changes to get to where they are, how do you keep them in that state with the idea that um, if they lose some of their genetic characteristics, you end up losing neuronal function and your worms stop having that beautiful sinusoidal motion, and instead they get kind of paralyzed and don't move really well. And we've actually recently in the lab established a model for ALS,
Hmm.
to study neuronal degeneration with C. elegans as a model. Um,
Okay, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I
So like you use microscopic worms to like even consider like how this could affect humans and understand like the nervous system of humans. 'Cause you mentioned
yeah
That's
Yes.
pretty cool. Yeah, wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I guess my next question to you, I was sort of thinking this, but I thought I'd save it for like later on in the interview. But I sort of want to ask you about like the future, like because now you're doing like because you talked a little bit about your high school experience, the current work that you're doing, and just like where do you see like yourself after this, and then um, like where do you see this field going, or like your research? What do you think is like the future of the work that you're doing right now?
Um, so I think that kind of entails two different questions, like what I want to do in my career and then
Yeah.
where the research is going. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Um, so for my own career, I definitely want to be a professor someday. I want to lead my own research group and then serve as an educator as well. So that'll entail in STEM fields, at least a very traditional path of you do your PhD and then you do one or two postdoctoral positions. And then from there, you'd apply for professorship jobs. But one of the things that happens in this career trajectory is when you move on to your postdoctoral position, it's not explicitly stated in any kind of rule book, but it's understood that you change either the model you work with or the question you ask.
Mhm.
So it's not encouraged for you to do your postdoctoral position in the same research that you've been doing your PhD in,
Okay.
because yeah, they want you to readjust and figure out how to think about something new and learn something new. Um, so I won't be there to personally contribute to my field, the field I'm in now after I'm done with my PhD as much, unless I do something really closely related. Um, but I think one of the beauties of working in science is that you don't necessarily know where it's going to go.
Yeah.
Have, right, your broad dreams of ideally we'd find some way to combat ALS by understanding, better its genetic mechanisms, or you just have a better idea of how the beauty of the world around you works. But these are all things that are very kind of broad picture, and you can't exactly point to like this is what it's going to be, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, it's like my favorite examples are of big scientific discoveries are always ones that were made on accident. So like penicillin or small RNA interference or CRISPR too was just a complete accident when people were studying completely unrelated things. So I'd like to say that I actually won't know where the field will go because I'm hoping it'll surprise me.
Okay. Um, that was a great response. I think my next question to you, I want to throw something like a little more fun at you. I'm like wondering what with all of the research that you've done so far, the classes that you've taken, like what has been your most like favorite experience in the field of biology in general? Like just a fun story or something.
Yeah. Oh my goodness, how do I pick?
The first one that comes to your mind, I guess.
First one that comes to mind. So I had an internship where I worked in it was very brief, but I studied heart development in zebrafish.
Hmm.
Um and zebrafish are particularly amenable to studying that kind of thing because they're very easy to visualize the hearts of, because the larvae are transparent, and
Hmm.
then they're also really good at surviving without a functional heart for the first like week of their life, just because they're so small they get by on oxygen diffusion alone. um
Hmm.
and so you can kind of perturb their circulatory systems in all kinds of ways to understand how the heart forms. um but I suppose I digress because that's not particularly relevant. I think my just favorite experience was being able to see that under the microscope, like to watch a heartbeat and you see the blood cells pass through, or you fix them and you stain them, and it comes up with just these gorgeous colors of these really intricate features. So like the actin fibers of the heart, that you could stain in like this in color in this bright red. Um, and there's just something so particularly striking about being able to see, like to have this visual representation of all these questions we ask. Like this is what it looks like when people want to understand the world around them, and it's gorgeous to see. And it put it allowed me to put a concrete visual to something that sometimes can get a little abstract. You know, you're sitting in your bio classes and you're learning the Krebs cycle for the 10th time over, and you're like, why do I care about any of this? And it's like, this is why I care.
Okay. Um, I guess my next question to you, I guess, to contrast from what you were sort of thinking about, what are some challenges that you face while doing research? And then also, yeah, like what's rewarding? Like you talked about what you liked and experienced in particular, but just in general, what do you think is rewarding about the work that you do, and what is sometimes challenging?
Yeah, those are really important questions. I think we'll start with the challenges. I think one of the big challenges is
Yeah.
things science is really messy.
Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
yeah, there's this idea. Like my little brother sat me down once at the dinner table and he's like, Honorine, I don't understand why PhDs take so long. And I know you're asking out of a good place, but that question drives me a little bit crazy because like I sit through the day to day and I know why it takes so long. And it's the idea that science is, like we were kind of talking about earlier, science is a walk in the dark. You don't have this
Mhm.
path that makes sense, no matter how much you kind of want it to make sense. Um, and you find all kinds of weird results and you don't really know what's going on. And I suppose it's a double-sided or a two-sided coin. It's two sides of the same coin, where it's like it's this challenge of like it's hard to fail so much because there's no reference you can come back to,
Mhm.
because you're the one doing it for the first time and you're learning something new. But the flip side of that, I think, is actually the most rewarding side of it, which is that I like it blows my mind that I get to learn something that absolutely no one has ever known before. Like I get to learn something absolutely new and I get to be the first person to look at it. Like I feel like one of those explorers that was like, oh my goodness, look at the Grand Canyon or whatever. And Saligion's neurons are a lot smaller than the Grand Canyon, but I find the principle to be the same. Um, and once you learn to be okay with things not working and with things not fitting this image you have, you find that the image that comes through is actually a lot more beautiful than what you
Mhm.
kind of predicted. So yeah, kind of that the challenges of not knowing where you're going that turn
Okay.
into words of not knowing where you're going. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I guess my next question to you is sort of about what your daily life looks like. So you mentioned like how you sit down and look at a lot of, can't speak again. But you mentioned how you work with microscopes and how you look at a lot of different like specimen a lot of times. But then, what are other things you do? Like, what does a typical day look like to you? Does your schedule change a lot? Is like who do you work with? Just things like that.
Yeah, I would say my schedule changes a fair bit day to day,
Mhm.
which is one of the things I like about the work I do is, and being in grad school in general, is that every day looks a little different.
Mhm.
Um, Usually there's a lot of, like you mentioned, there's a lot of looking under the microscope, taking images, analyzing those images, or just like maintaining the different lines of worms you work with. There's also like a wide array of wet lab experiments that you can do. So things that are more molecular, you can extract RNA, you can turn it into DNA, you can amplify it, you can um, create genetic constructs, you can inject those constructs. So a lot of different things to be doing at the level of just like messing with actual worms and
Mhm.
the associated material. But then there's also a good chunk of it that's trying to interpret your data into a way that makes sense, preparing presentations, going to
Mhm.
seminars, doing a lot of readings, and then a fair bit of writing too. Um, so
Mhm.
it's yeah, a lot of wet lab work and a lot of intellectual work that complement one another.
Okay. Um, So I guess we talked about like what you do on a day-to-day basis, and I sort of wanted to ask you about the University of Chicago. And I know like someone's experience in the university as an undergrad would definitely be different from the experience you have as a postdoctorate, like student or doc. Yeah, okay, you understand what I'm saying. I can't speak. But yeah, so I just wanted to ask you about some of the things you do, like outside of not work, but like outside of your research sort of work, and just like extracurriculars I guess you're part of now, and just the environment and how the university is like?
Yeah, I would say my biggest like university related extracurricular is the educational outreach I do. It's like working
Mhm.
with Splash to give classes is one. One of my lab mates and I now are putting together an outreach program called Axon Outreach with a couple other girls in the neuroscience department. And it's kind of been a similar theme to Splash. You know, you reach out to high school students to help get them engaged and even make them aware, like you're doing now, of like the different possibilities that there are within this field.
Mhm.
Uh, so a fair bit of that. Um, but other than that, most of my extracurriculars are like things I do at home unrelated to the universities. Like I like to run, I like to read, um,
Mhm.
stuff like that. So I'm assuming that's not so much what you're asking about, but yeah.
Okay. No, that works. I think it's like really cool. I actually wanted to. I'm gonna ask you about something that like is sort of. I'm kind of curious about. Like, how do you like the field of neuroscience? Because like I know in just different majors you have like biology. In general, you have molecular biology, and it's always surprised me that like neuroscience has always had a separate like major just for that. And I feel like that implies that there's so much to learn that like if you're because I mean, I don't think there are necessarily like majors about like the heart, but I mean, there are majors about like neuroscience. I always thought that it's been like really cool. So, but like, what do you feel about the field, I guess?
Yeah. I'll preface by saying that it might sound like a semantic difference, but neuroscience and neurobiology are actually there's overlap, but very different conceptually.
Okay.
Yeah, so the work I do ends up being more like the molecular underpinnings of the nervous system
Uh-huh.
versus a lot of the people I know that work in
Oh,
neuro.
so neuroscience is more like maybe psychology and things like that. Is that?
Like yeah, like really large like brain circuitry, usually higher order
Uh-huh.
organisms. So picture like the electrodes in the brain of the rhesus macaque or whatever, like that kind of um like yeah, higher level, more functional, more behavioral versus the side.
Neurobiology is like more focused on the neurons and like how they work. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than the higher order structure they contribute to. Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. I did not know that. So, and just I guess we're sort of nearing the end of like the 30 minutes I wanted to speak to you. I guess the question I have for you is just sort of like, what is one piece of advice you would give to a high school student who's listening to this interview right now, or maybe yourself as a high school student? What would you sort of say to them?
Um, oh, that's a good one. Hold on. Um, hmm. Okay, I would say I think that especially going on into college,
Mhm.
um, I had difficulty not being good at things. That sounds like really cocky, but it's like when you get to the classes that you really struggle in, those are the most frustrating and the ones you don't particularly want to always deal with, but they're the ones you learn the most in because you can't know how to extend your limits until you've met them. And so I would give the advice that struggling is a good thing. Within reason, you don't want to be like collapsing in on yourself, but um, there's when you're challenging yourself is when you're learning most,
Mhm.
and not to discourage yourself with early failures. My dad loves to tell me that you learn more when you fail than when you succeed. Um,
Mhm.
and I definitely there's a lot of work that takes into getting places like graduate school, and to be in graduate school is a fair amount of work, but it's incredibly rewarding work. And so if you just remember to stay grateful for the opportunities you have to struggle, it helps make it a little easier. um but yeah, I think that's what I'd give.
Okay, yeah. Again, I guess I just really want to thank you for your time today and all of your responses. I know I wasn't completely put together throughout the entire thing, so um, yeah, it was so nice to be able to talk to you and just like hear about your experiences and your enthusiasm for like the work that you do. Sometimes you were talking about the worms or the heart, and it like I could picture it, and it's just like it's so fun. Like I agree with you that like there's so much to learn in biology, and just like any go into any field, I think, and just like discover so much. And yeah, it is like you're an explorer. Like a lot of things that you said, the way you phrased it and the way you like described the work that you do is just very like moving, I would say. Like because I could relate to it too, and I just want to thank you for your time today, and all of your help.
Of course, I was really glad I could talk to you and we could chat about all this, and I'm glad you found something worth listening to, the things I had to say. So I really hope it'll help and it'll help all your classmates. I think it's a really lovely idea.
Thank you. Okay, I'll end.